Welcome back to History.com after that commercial break and a word from our sponsors. I have to keep myself entertained here somehow. Welcome back, though, part 2 of the first Americans. We left off here, whether you realize it or not, history's biggest fraud, with a question mark, the move to agriculture and the Neolithic Revolution. And the Neolithic period is defined by the move to agriculture. So around 10 to 5,000 years ago, or even more recently, depending on what part of the world we're talking about, some hunter-gatherers, some hunter-gatherer societies and groups began to either learn or practice an agriculture that they'd already learned, and this changed the way of life. I mean, it made a revolutionary change of life inevitable on the other side of this. So Neolithic Revolution is not an overstatement. This is one of the great turning points in world history. Again, it didn't happen all in one place at one time, but it's a gigantic change. So, or that is to say, in other words, any society that moves from hunting and gathering to agriculture goes through changes across the board that makes the whole thing a turning over of society, a complete change in virtually every aspect of a society. The only other change that's similar to this and of the same or similar magnitude is the Industrial Revolution, which comes, of course, millennia later, about 350 years ago, from our perspective today, in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, when one society after another, again, not all at the same time, began to move from primarily rural agricultural societies where goods were made mostly by hand to a factory system of mass production where goods were made and distributed through modern technology, machinery, etc. That change also eventuated in a change across the board, economically, socially, politically, culturally, etc. So this is one of the major turning points in all of world history. As a current history professor that's written now a number of best-selling books, kind of a big star on the scene in the history profession these days, says, in a really good book, about 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, or he just shortens it to sapiens, meaning us, began to devote almost all their time and effort to manipulating the lives of a few animals and plant species. From sunrise to sunset, humans sowed seeds, watered plants, plucked weeds from the ground, and led sheep to prime pastures. It was a revolution in the way humans lived, the agricultural revolution. There was no turning back. No turning back for reasons that we'll kind of get into as we go along here. But what does history's biggest fraud with the question mark mean? Well, in the above quoted historian's book, there's a whole chapter with that title. And he does, apparently, I read the book, believe that the move to agriculture and urban/agricultural societies was history's biggest fraud, meaning it's been traditionally portrayed as a huge step forward for humankind, a big advance, progress, an improvement, but he is saying it's been vastly overrated. I put a question mark next to it because I think the point is arguable. His take is an interpretation. Yet again, back to another one of our tools from our introductory lecture. These will keep coming, so that's why I stressed that lecture so heavily. History's biggest fraud? Maybe. He has a point, but it is arguable. The move to agriculture takes us from Paleolithic, which really is about hunter-gatherers, to Neolithic, which, as I said, is defined by the move to intentional sowing of seeds and harvesting of crops first horticulture, then agriculture, and a corresponding move that generally happens around the same time, and that is the domestication of animals. So the domestication of plants and animals at around the same time. So all of this happened independently in multiple parts of the globe. It appears to have begun first in an area known to scholars as the Fertile Crescent in what's now Iraq, parts of Turkey, etc., etc. And this appears to be the first part of the world that moved to agriculture. And it spread from there into Europe eventually, but not long thereafter, it also appeared independently, meaning it didn't spread there, but was created or invented in China, Mesoamerica, India. Scholars believe there were at least 6 different parts of the world that on their own, without help from anybody else, developed agriculture independently. From there it spread everywhere else. So the Europeans didn't invent agriculture, they learned it through kind of a gradual creep and spread of ideas and peoples from the Fertile Crescent eventually into the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and then further west into what's now like France and Great Britain, etc. So it didn't happen all at once. Why did people start to move to farming? It used to be thought, say a number of decades ago, by archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, that once people learned agriculture, they of course would move into it, because the agricultural way of life must be better, or must have been better than hunting and gathering. Everyone knew it was a step up, knew it would make a better life and lifestyle for everyone, so of course they're going to move to it. More recent scholarship and evidence indicates that that wasn't necessarily always true, that some people, maybe even most people that became farmers, were trapped into it. The trap of sedentism, as it's sometimes called. Sedentism is another word for permanent cities, permanent urban centers. So sedentism, sedentary peoples are peoples that live in one place all year round. Villages, towns, cities. And as we've already noted, hunter-gatherers don't have an incentive to build villages, towns, and cities because they're on the move too much. They build campsites in more impermanent structures like tents. But now, and this is one of the momentous changes that comes along with and is concomitant to agriculture, that people have an interest in staying put. And so since their plants and animals can be put right there, seeds put into the soil to our left and pastures for animals to our right, then we are going to dig in right here and build a town. So this is one of the many big changes that comes about through agricultural development. So urban agricultural, though that sounds kind of counterintuitive, they actually go together, as they still do in our world to this day. So what do we mean by the trap of sedentism, though? So there are a number of peoples whose lifestyles have been studied through archaeological finds, archaeological sites in different parts of the world. A handful of them, maybe the most famous of them being the group you see on the screen known as the Natufians, whose society existed in what's now present-day Israel. And there are other groups like this too. We'll even see one in Native America later on, but all in good time. So what appears to have happened, at least in some cases, is not that people, once they learned how to farm, how to do agriculture, that they jumped right into it because they recognized it was obviously better than hunting and gathering, that some of them got trapped into it without realizing it. So how could this happen? Well, the theory goes like this, that some peoples that came across, the hunter-gatherers that came across one of those gardens of Eden we talked about before, a place sort of teeming with edible stuff, wild growing edible plants all over the place, lots of animals that can be eaten, hunted. So why would a group of people, that's a hunter-gatherer group, continue to move around chasing the food when they don't have to? And the answer is they probably wouldn't. So there were places in the world, Gardens of Eden, that were so filled already year-round with edible materials, plants or animals or both, that people started to build villages and towns there. And the Natufians are one of those. This was kind of a shocker at first. I think it was the Natufians that were found to be doing this first, I believe. But there have been others in other parts of the world since. But it was kind of a shocker because it had been assumed, as I said, by scholars for decades and decades that people only started to build towns, villages, permanent settlements after they learned to and started farming. But here with the Natufians, we see a people that were, at least, if you go far back enough, they were still hunting and gathering, or they were still technically hunter-gatherers, but were staying in one place. Why? Because there was plenty of food nearby. This is a good example of, and the most classic example of the trap of sedentism. So what's the trap? Well, again, this gets back to what I said about climate before and population growth. So let's say a group of people at one point stumbles upon a Garden of Eden and they realize, in a fairly short amount of time, I don't think we need to keep moving around. This place is a gold mine. We're going to be able to live here, and fill our bellies, eat. We have everything we need right here. Why keep moving around? So they start to, not immediately, but over time, they start to build more permanent structures, and pretty soon they've got a village, then eventually a town on their hands. But they're still kind of going out and gathering, but they don't have to go too far because it's all right there. Naturally growing, plants, wild animals that are all right in the vicinity. Okay, so plenty of food, but of course, plenty of food, or a lot of food, always goes hand in hand with population growth. So when there's lots of food, there's a growing population. When there's a growing population, there's lots of food. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem in some ways. It seems to be mutually reinforcing. So the Natufians appear to have lived then, a good life for a long period of time in this Garden of Eden until the population rose to a certain level and they started to hit an ecological ceiling, meaning that the amount of food stayed roughly the same every year because they weren't tweaking it, through agriculture. They were, going with what was provided to them by nature. But what is a cornucopia of food for, say, a population of 100 people might be, starvation levels for 500 people. So when population grows generation after generation, because of, or partly because of the abundance of food, eventually it can sort of turn the tables. Nature can turn the tables on you, and now you don't have enough food. And some of these groups, the Natufians included, appear to have already had the know-how, the knowledge necessary to do farming. They'd been observing wild plants and animals for millennia. The knowledge had been passed down. We already have, I think, gotten ourselves acquainted with how much knowledge hunter-gatherers had to have and did have. So they probably already understood how plants worked. You have to have seeds. The seeds in the plants are what you put into the ground. You put water on them, enough sunlight on them, various other factors, and they grow on their own from there. So the knowledge appears to have already been there, but they didn't really need to use it. Just like they didn't need to run around long distances any longer because they were in a Garden of Eden, they also didn't need to work at planting crops because the crops were just growing on their own, in wild form, but still edible. But when the population grows so high that it's no longer a Garden of Eden any longer, then they think, oops, what do we do now? Well, let's go back to gathering. We'll just start moving further away. If we have to leave our city, then we have to leave our city because we have to survive. But there's a problem. Let's say it's 200 years after the group first found and occupied this Garden of Eden, put down permanent roots there. What's the problem? Well, see, who's here still remembers how to do hunting and gathering? Oh, crap. Nobody. Right? The last person that remembered it died decades ago. We don't have anybody that has the skills. That buildup of knowledge had been left to decay and was ignored because they didn't think they were going to need it again. So they don't have any true hunter-gatherers with them again. They could, of course, try, and there are some groups that may have done so, but it would have been not the, I think, optimal strategy. So what they're left with, if they don't have enough food where they are, unless they take, further measures, and they don't really have the skills, or so they believe, to go back out to do the traditional, wide-ranging hunting and gathering over a lot of territory, constantly on the move. We know how to make plants sort of come to us in a sense, and animals come to us. We're going to have to. We don't really want to. That's why it's a trap. And we liked the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, especially when we could remain in one place, but now we don't have a choice. So we're going to have to take some of those skills, some of the knowledge that we've acquired of plant life and animal life, and use it, and just increase the food supply here. We've already invested a lot of resources, time and effort and energy into building this village, so we're going to employ that knowledge for the first time. We didn't think we needed it before. We didn't really want to do it. Now we have no choice. So this is how farming, in some ways, to some peoples, may have been a trap more than something that seemed, that they wanted to do, something that they were, eager to get into. So, domestication of plants and animals, again, means, bringing them sort of close, controlling them more, bringing them to you. I can imagine that wherever this change to farming happened, that there was a great sense of confidence that came along with it, maybe even overconfidence, because it's as if the people are saying, no, we're not going to chase plants and animals around any longer. We don't do that. We're going to bring them right here. We're going to put here's our village, and we're going to put the plants right here, and they're going to grow right under our nose, right where we want them. And we're going to put the animals on the other side of the village in a pasture, or fence them in, and they're going to be right here. We've just tamed nature. We're not running around after nature any longer. We're bringing nature and what we need from it right to us. So this is what happens. So what does it mean exactly to domesticate plants and animals? Well, there are a couple of things that I think are worth saying here, and this is why I put my little picture of a wheat stalk on the right side of the page. That's not just for effect. Sometimes my pictures are just for effect, but not in this case. So to domesticate means to, again, kind of take control of and sort of use, for your own purposes. But it goes farther than that. If something is fully domesticated, plant or animal, it means it can't survive without the human interference any longer. So plants or animal, take your pick, which plant or animal that was once wild, at least this strain of it, this batch of it in our fields, is now no longer able to exist on its own. What that means really is it can't reproduce on its own any longer, or it can't function on its own any longer. It's one of the two, or both. So animals. There's strong evidence that the first animal ever domesticated, and you've probably already guessed it, your dog. Dogs were domesticated thousands and thousands of years ago, and it's a good example of what full domestication means. Could your dog survive out in the wild? Maybe. My dog couldn't. There's no way. My dog's the most lovable dog in the world, but he gets scared if he gets accidentally locked outside, for 2 minutes without us around. Because dogs have been domesticated. Cats are better kind of on their own, but a domesticated cat has a tougher time than a feral cat out in the wild. So animals, maybe aren't ever completely domesticated, but they can be pretty close. My dog is pretty close. Plants can definitely really do define full domestication. And again, wheat is a good example. That's why I put it here. And wheat, of course, is a foodstuff that's a staple crop in many parts of the world even today, and certainly was at the beginning of agriculture. At least if the stuff grew naturally there. So, from the point of view of the plant, from the wheat plant or stalk itself, the good wheat stalks are those that you see the stalk right here. Are the stalks that crumble easily. So when the wind blows a little bit, this stuff starts to fall into the ground because the seeds are in there. And every living thing, its sort of main job is to reproduce itself into succeeding generations. So a good wheat stalk, from the plant's point of view, not that plants really have a point of view, mind you, but from the plant's perspective, the good wheat stalk is the one that crumbles really easily. But of course, if humans want to eat it, the wheat stalk and the wheat, not the whole stalk, but the chaff or the part that remains after, then they want the defective wheat stalks, the ones that don't crumble as easily, and some do and some don't, just by random genetic variation. But the defective ones, from the plant's point of view, are the fantastic ones from the human point of view. So when human beings realized that wild growing wheat was edible, they started to notice this and that about wheat and other types of grains. Similar things are true of corn and other domesticable, edible plants. So the wheat stalk, then, it's noticed that the ones that are better for us are the ones that when you touch them, they don't just start fall onto the ground and spread into the wind. The ones that stay kind of whole or mostly together, and we pick those very carefully and take them home. But God, it would be great if we could have all or most of the stalks stay intact instead of sort of blowing in the wind. Pardon the pun there on a famous song. And so what do? This is the knowledge that is comes to them by paying attention, by out of necessity, trying to increase or store knowledge in their heads as much as they can to take advantage of every possible supply of food or tools, or whatever they can get. We've already seen this about prehistoric peoples. They had to be resourceful. So it becomes clear, since we're already just cutting the stalks of the ones that stick together. That's the only ones we can take out anyway. They're gonna, if they crumble on the way out back to our encampment or village, it's worthless. Then they start to realize, wait a minute, the seeds from these, if we put them in the ground close to home, we have to walk 3 miles, 5 miles as it is. Let's put them right outside our village, and we're only bringing the ones back that have the stalks intact. And if we plant the seeds from those, let's see what happens. And they didn't know, of course, about genetics in those days, but just through trial and error, they could see that what happens is eventually you start getting fields that have more and more stalks that stay intact, and fewer stalks that sort of blow with every single breeze, and are lost, at least to someone that wants to eat, wheat, or make it into, whatever they make it into, bread or whatever else. And in time, then, what that means is you have entire fields of wheat that basically don't drop their seeds, don't spread their seeds out into the ground, because they can't. They've been genetically modified Yes, these are GMOs in a sense. If you think genetically modified food is something modern and something new, think again. Basically, everything you buy at the grocery store, even if it's uh, you know something that seems natural, right? It's all been modified over long periods of time. So going back thousands of years, everything. The wheat plant then can't reproduce. At least the wheat plants in your wheat field, if you're the farmer, they're now reliant for them to reproduce. They have to have you save some of the seeds every harvest, hold them aside, and the next harvest season go out and plant them in the ground. We know that that's what farmers do. Why are they planting them? Because the plants themselves that used to be able to do it on their own can't any longer. They've been genetically modified. Now, that's not true of the wheat plants growing wild that are 5 miles from the village. They're still, they're still wild and they can still reproduce. But the ones that you've domesticated can't reproduce, and this is the major part of the definition of domesticate or domesticated. So this is somewhat crucial to understanding how both farming and domestication of animals works. Right? Sheep, goats, cattle, cows, horses eventually, they're tamed. They become domesticated and bred for traits that make them, more efficacious for humans. So, you don't want kind of the manic, sheep or goats. You don't want to bring them into your herd and then have them reproduce. You want the more sort of pliable, right? The kind of more chill sheep and goats, and then breed those with other chill goats, and then they have them compliant and docile, and that sort of spreads through the gene pool then, and this is exactly what happens. So it's a huge change, but not just for those sort of more specific reasons, but for all of its knockoff effects. Remember, the Neolithic Revolution is a revolution in everything. So what effect did it have? We see villages, towns, and cities. We already know that Neolithic, the move to agriculture brings, in most places for the first time, city life, urban life. Political systems change, really become at least complex political systems for the first time. Economies change and become complex economies for the first time, only in urban-based or urban-centered cultures and societies. We see military changes, religious changes, changes in values, etc., etc. Just to give us one example, hunter-gatherers, and we'll see this in Native America, and especially when Native Americans collide with, or vice versa, I guess we should say, Europeans collide with Native Americans. The two have different value systems, partly because Native Americans were, at least many of them were still hunter-gatherers, and Europeans were all farmers by that time, almost all. So their value systems were entirely different. And with the hunter-gatherer value system, there's no real concept of private property, at least the individual property ownership. That doesn't make sense if you're moving around all the time, and group behavior, collective activity, cooperation is necessary for survival. Saying, hey, this is my piece of land, you get your ass off of it, you keep your ass off of it, doesn't really make sense. But when you have permanent cities, permanent countries and kingdoms, eventually, as these things start to get bigger and bigger in terms of size, population, etc., then it does start to make sense to be able to say, this is my land. I worked this and planted everything here and fenced it all in. I worked hard for this. It's my piece of property. You stay off. Hunter-gatherers don't have a concept of private property. So that's just one of many examples of change. And again, we need to recognize this. I know I'm harping on this a lot, but I want to get a firm foundation so we understand this. Just that one example alone, and I could give you many, many, many others. That's a gigantic change. It doesn't happen overnight, but over time, when a people moves from foragers to farmers, They go from having concepts of land that are about, well, nobody really owns the land. We're, happy to be using it and thankful to the gods for being able to use it. We have to fight off enemies sometimes so that we can survive, but none of us individually own any of the land. That doesn't even make sense. But once you move to an urban agricultural society, society based on farming and domestication of animals, then you start to see a radically new concept, at least first, of private property ownership pop up. So that's a good example of all of this. The revolutionary nature of all of this. So this allowed or forced humans into larger and larger units, requiring these type of fictional stories, or sometimes true stories, but maybe sort of blown out of proportion a little bit. Myths. What one historian calls intersubjective reality. Scholars usually divide between objectivity and subjectivity. The objective world, sort of the world of things, and the subjective world of kind of our minds and our own sort of feelings and imagination and opinions, etc. But this scholar, I'll keep his name out of it just to keep it simpler, believes that there's kind of an in-between category of intersubjective. So that the stories that bind or glue societies together, keep them glued together, they can be true, but they don't have to be. The point is, as long as everybody or most people enough to keep that glue, the unit over the whole together, the society as a whole together, as long as enough people believe the story, then it works. So it can be intersubjective in that it might be a fictional story, but if it's a story that somehow binds people into loyalty, into feeling sort of we're together as one group, then it works, and societies then can get bigger and bigger. That's not the only ingredient necessary to be able to build and sustain larger societies, but it's certainly a crucial one. It's a necessary, if not a sufficient one. And now finally we get to Native Americans proper, and I give you here the 5 main things to remember about Native Americans. I'll unpack these a little bit afterwards, but number 1, the societies changed over time. Number 2, Native Americans developed complex societies. Number 3, they had quite diverse cultures. 4, they adapted to nature and also manipulated it at the same time. And 5, the differences with Europeans and other peoples of other parts of the world were great. We're singling out Europeans, of course, because these two groups do collide and will by our next unit. So we want to get some handle on Native American views, ways of doing things, ways of thinking versus Europeans now before we get into the next and following units. So back to the top. Okay, Native American societies changed over time. Don't all societies change over time? Yes, of course they do. The problem is when Europeans, after the first contact, the collision between the two, anthropologists primarily, starting in the 19th century, European anthropologists studying peoples in other parts of the world, when there were still hunter-gatherers, at least in some parts of this or that country or kingdom, they started to, in a sense, kind of romanticize. They didn't necessarily mean to, but they were sort of carried away with what they found, and partly because in Europe, European countries were going through the Industrial Revolution, which was disorienting and changed the way of life, as I already mentioned, in all kinds of significant, substantial ways, not all of which were, agreeable to people. Capitalism, industrial capitalism, sort of economic priorities people becoming or feeling like they're just a number, materialistic values replacing more spiritual values, etc. And so when these anthropologists coming from that part of the world, that background, going through those changes, found a people that seemed to, had not gone through an industrial revolution, and seemed to them to be kind of happier, simpler life, and kind of a more pure life, not corrupted by industrial capitalism. They tended to kind of romanticize them. As one scholar now critical of what those 19th century intellectuals did, called this sort of a belief in timeless ethnographic purity. Ethnographic just kind of means cultural. So timeless cultural purity. So without necessarily intending to, a lot of European scholars started to see indigenous peoples, including in Native America, or in the Americas, as sort of being timelessly pure. Meaning, well, they're so pure and everything's so good there, why would they change? Their societies have probably been, pretty much the same. Even though they didn't really go back and study the history, they just kind of made an assumption. And from the same viewpoint, because it all fits together here, they also kind of assumed that the only thing that really caused such timeless purity to change was when Europeans came and sort of messed everything up for everybody else, and then it forced them into changes that were unwelcome and unhealthy, which of course could be true, but it's the perspective of early anthropologists primarily, and the downside to it, or one of the downsides, is that it painted a picture of Native American societies that was not only romanticized, but then it sort of made it look like the society stayed static. That's a tongue twister. Societies stayed static over time, but no society does that. So it was kind of a myth. Number two, complex societies. Why do we need to focus on this? Well, mainly because I still think it's there's a common misnomer even now that indigenous peoples, sort of were backwards, that they, weren't as smart as, they weren't as advanced as Europeans or people in certain parts of the world, and in some ways, hunter-gatherers, were backwards in the sense that their lives and societies were smaller and somewhat simpler. I don't mean simple-minded. We already know that hunter-gatherers had to be really smart and have a ton of knowledge, maybe more than us. There's one scholar right now that believes that it's likely that hunter-gatherers were smarter than we are. I'm not kidding. It's controversial, but he believes it, and it wouldn't surprise me, given how much they needed to know and how much they needed to use their brains to survive. We don't have to use our brains as much because the technology and our society sort of is already guiding us a lot. So there could be truth in this, but nonetheless, it's still somewhat common to believe that industrial societies, modern high-tech societies, are more complex and, in a sense, superior to indigenous societies. And so we need to make it clear that these societies were very complex in many ways, and in certain ways were equal to the complexity of European society, in some ways even superior to it. So we have to get rid of that notion of superior and inferior. Third, their cultures were diverse. This sort of seems to go without saying as well, but along kind of with that early kind of stereotype or romanticization of Native Americans, right, timeless ethnographic purity, which often has been, and more often has been referred to as kind of the myth of the noble savage. The myth going back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century Enlightenment in France. The idea spread, of course, and is still around in some ways. And of course, that's a compliment and a prejudice at the same time. They're noble, but they're backward savages. The noble savage. But understanding the diversity, like understanding the complexity, is a way to sort of help us get away from at least the savage part of noble savage. They may have been noble, but they certainly weren't savages. And if we don't recognize and really study the diversity, we have a tendency, and it does exist in our popular culture, you see it in the movies and TV, to reduce Native Americans to sort of a stereotype of kind of one group. I've never heard a student say this, but I'm convinced, and I don't just mean students, Americans, people, I'm convinced there are people that think that, say, Native Americans spoke Native American. I never heard anybody say that, but I'm convinced that there are people that think that. But truth be told, and you may already know this, there were hundreds of Native American languages, hundreds of them, and hundreds of different cultural groups that had different political systems, different religious beliefs, different types of succession and hereditary patterns, patrilineal, matrilineal, kin-based groups, tributary groups, etc., etc. So a great deal of diversity in Native America. They adapted to nature and manipulated nature. Well, that's true of everybody else as well. So all these things on here are obvious in a sense, but applied to Native Americans, there's good reason for stating the obvious. And I'm trying to give you the reasons here before we go forward. So, okay, part of this also is about the tendency to romanticize Native Americans and sort of treat them as if they're all the same all the time. They never change. And this has to do kind of with the view that Native Americans took sort of virtually perfect care of nature and were more concerned about nature, a more loving, had a more tender relationship with nature than Europeans who just came in and chopped down trees and, despoiled the environment. And there is some truth to that, by the way. We'll see later on why I think it's true that Native Americans were at least somewhat better about handling nature with care than Europeans. That being said, Native Americans did despoil nature. We already mentioned that they probably had a hand, if not more, in hunting some of the megafauna into extinction, or all of the megafauna into extinction, the largest animals in the Americas. We'll also see later that they used fire quite assertively, not just to cook food and to provide warmth and light, but also to get rid of insects that are unwanted, etc., etc. And sometimes those fires that they set caused long-term environmental problems. So they weren't trying to do that. They weren't trying to do it irresponsibly. Nonetheless, to sort of think that Native Americans were out sort of there, hugging trees all the time, is, I think, a simplification. In my view, and it's my view, you don't need to share it, but in my view, I think we underestimate Native Americans when we stereotype them positively as well as negatively. Of course, if we stereotype somebody negatively, that's not a good thing. But what I'm saying is, even when we make these positive stereotypes, Native Americans all love nature and they were tree huggers, it sort of makes them look simplistic. And they were much more complicated than that because they were much more intelligent, as intelligent as anyone else. So I actually think this kind of stereotyping, even if it's saying something nice about Native Americans, not only is it not true, and my goal is to give you the truth in history as much as possible, but it's also, I think, underrates Native Americans unfairly. So we need to say them in all of their complexity, which gets us back to number 2. Number 5, we've already really said. We will have plenty of opportunity here as we go forward to compare and contrast Native American values with the European values that they're going to learn about against their will. To what degree has changed over time in ancient America? We're talking about ancient America 15,000 years ago, the first peoples ever, about climate and ecology. Remember, we did something on this already. So we'll kind of shelve that question. We already kind of know the answer from a global vantage point. But let's put that aside for momentarily and move to the Bering Strait crossings, Question mark. So what was this? The Bering Strait crossings is the point of entry for Native Americans. So remember I told you that before around, it's around 15,000 years ago, the Americas were uninhabited by humans. So where did they come from? They came from the Bering Strait. And the evidence is overwhelming here, though there is one counter theory, but I think it's very, very unlikely to have merit to it. But where's the Bering Strait? If you don't already know, look at the map on the screen, the upper left corner of the map. That landmass there you see in green with ice beneath it is present-day Alaska. And if you look there, there's a little kind of branch of land at the bottom of Alaska, kind of moving out into the ocean and kind of disappears off the off of the map. That's the Bering Strait sort of area. And just on the other side, that's actually a small bit of water there. It's not too far to get to the other side. What's today? You say it before I do. Good, you're right. Modern day Russia. Right? So that Russia's a vast country geographically. It was all the way to the Pacific, and that's the eastern Pacific end of Russia. So just across the Bering Strait from Alaska is Russia, which, of course, is in Asia, at least that part of it. So what we're saying is that the first peoples to inhabit the Americas migrated from Asia. So they do have sort of an Asian sort of cultural and genetic background. This is part of the strong evidence that tells us that the Bering Strait was the point of entry for the first Americans. And 15,000 or so years ago, they didn't even need to have watercraft to come across. Although they may have in some crossings, there may have been a number of waves, as we'll see, of migrations, and at least one of them they may have used primitive watercraft to get across. You didn't need sophisticated, navigational equipment and technology and ships, because you're just going to aim it to the other side, and it's just not that far away. But they didn't even need to most or all the time. Why? Because this is during an ice age. That's why you see the big sheets of ice there. A cold climate period in history. This is the last ice age that we've had, in the world, and it recedes kind of just after this, or starts to recede just after this. But during the ice age, or during ice ages, what happens to the seas, the oceans of the world? The sea level goes down. And so when the sea level was down, it meant that before and after was a waterway between Alaska and Siberia, or eastern end of Russia, was now a natural land/ice bridge. So for the most part, these peoples walked across from Russia or Asia to Alaska. Now, why did they come across? They wanted a vacation in Alaska? They wanted to move to a new continent? No, of course. You already know the answer to this. They were hunter-gatherers chasing food around, and it sort of lured them into Alaska. And of course, they didn't know they were moving into another continent. Nobody had ever been here before. I'm sure they did know that this place was unrecognizable. This is somewhere new we haven't been before, but they wouldn't have known what the landmass looked like. With no maps yet. So the Bering Strait crossings are where this happened. There's also the eyeball test, which certainly isn't scientific, but it is logical. And that is that if you look at a map of the Americas, and this only has North America on it, but if you look at a map of North and South America and say, okay, if I didn't know anything else about this, and I was told that, people hadn't lived here before in these two continents, and then they eventually came from other parts of the world, where's the most logical point that they would have entered the Americas? And you know what it would be? The Bering Strait. Why? It's simple. It's the part of the Americas that's closest to the nearest landmass, nearest large landmass over. Right, if you're in Brazil the closest landmass is Africa. That's all the way across the Atlantic. So much less likely that people were going to have come that way. This was, so the eyeball test tells you that that part of the map is the most likely spot anyway. And guess what? The evidence of kind of from many different directions converging on the conclusion that it was the Bering Strait is overwhelming. So the move into all the Americas happened as these two gigantic ice sheets, the Cordilleran and the Laurentide ice sheets, they are known to scholars, were sort of in the process of slowly melting. We'll skip the younger Dryas. We need not get into that. And we'll talk about a move to agriculture here over time. But at first, the peoples, as you can see, are stuck in Alaska. A pretty lovely place to be stuck, though with formidable weather, but they're stuck there for a number of thousand years until these ice sheets start to melt. We see here a map of Native Americans. At least this is a linguistic diversity to give us a sense of the diversity. Actually, we could subdivide these categories even further. And when I said earlier that there were hundreds of different Native American languages, I didn't mean that there were just different dialects. If you went far enough away from where you lived, you'd meet other Native Americans eventually that you had no ability to understand at all. They're speaking a totally foreign language to you. Now, this is true worldwide. If you don't go too far away, there's still enough words similar that you can sort of converse. But the further and further you get away, there comes a point where we don't understand what they're saying. So there's big linguistic diversity in the Americas. Once again, this is just North America, but the same is true in South America and Central America as well. Beringia, right? That's the name scholars use to talk about the Bering Strait during this period thousands of years ago, where there was a natural land bridge, which you can see there. So the arrow basically means the direction that they were traveling. And I'm not going to get into this one because I kind of already talked about it, but the evidence is overwhelming that is where they came from a number of different types of evidence. There's dental evidence, linguistic, as you see at the top left, genetic, skeletal evidence, and on and on. And that's powerful. I mentioned also, I keep bringing this up, the introductory lecture that I mentioned the idea of convergence of evidence, science and law, but in any kind of field of scholarship, this is a useful tool. What does that mean? It means the case for a conclusion is much more powerful if you not only have multiple strands of evidence, but if they're coming from different places, they're different types of evidence. So if you have dental records that are showing you, telling you, hey, the dental records indicate that the first peoples came from Asia. Okay, well, that's one piece of evidence. So, okay, enough to raise an eyebrow. That's interesting. But then if you find linguistic evidence to back it up, different type of evidence, dental records, right, are not the same as linguistic evidence, and yet it comes to the same conclusion. The linguistic evidence also shows that the people came from Asia, from Siberia. You analyze genetic evidence. Guess what? Same place. So the evidence converges. Right, from sort of a lot of different points of departure on one point, one conclusion, that the Bering Strait is the answer to the question, where did the first inhabitants of America come from? Convergence of evidence is a powerful, powerful thing. So who were they, the first Americans? So they were from Asia. That part's not controversial, but some of this is controversial. When they arrived is somewhat controversial, around 15,000 years ago, but there's some variation in the estimates and theories from different scholars. There's an interpretive disagreement there still. Did they come from Southeast Asia, Northern Asia, or was there more than one migration? So that they may have come from a number of different parts of Asia, not one group at one time, but a number of different groups sort of coming to the Americas. That's all still, I put question marks because this is again an area where archaeology and related subjects get kind of exciting because it's kind of like the unsolved mysteries on TV, and I'm sure we'll learn more as the decades unfold, as new studies and new discoveries are done and made. But there's some question marks here now. For a long time, a group of people that were labeled the Clovis people were thought to be the first group to settle in the Americas and to settle in Alaska and then move into the Americas further below once the ice sheets opened up the possibility. And however, to show you how explosive the study of this can be, I forget how long ago it was. It was quite a while ago now, but one archaeologist on a dig in Monteverde, Chile. Chile's at the southern part of South America, a long way from Alaska. He did a dig there and came to the conclusion from a number of sort of different types of evidence, again, convergence of evidence, that these people predated the Clovis people, whose archaeological sites were found in, say, what's modern-day America, way further to the north. So if true, what it meant was, wait a minute, you're saying that a group of people, the first group of people ever in the Americas, went across the Bering Strait into Alaska and then all the way down through North, Central, and South America to the very bottom of South America and settled there first? And then people after them didn't go as far and settled in what's the present day United States and other parts of the Americas. And the answer was and is apparently yes. We don't know why. We don't know how. Is it possible that theory could get overturned? Yes, but the evidence is pretty solid. I haven't dug into it a great deal, but one interesting thing happened that I think makes this a likely truth, even though we haven't explained, again, the how and the why yet. Doesn't mean we won't. More to come on this. Stay tuned. I don't mean right now, but eventually this might be, we might get to the bottom of this mystery. But there was lots of criticism, as you might expect, from other archaeologists in publications, journal articles, and three of the biggest archaeologists, biggest names, wrote sort of separate criticisms of this guy's findings. And he eventually invited all three of them to come to Chile and inspect the evidence for themselves. So they kind of ripped him in their own journal articles from his own journal articles, claiming what he found and making the conclusions that he did, drawing the conclusions he did. And so he said, well, okay, come on down and look at the evidence. I'll open it all to you. You can look at it on your own. And they went down, I think, together as a group, and all three of them, these are big names in archaeology, all three of them ended up doing a mea culpa and saying, you know what, I think he's right. And they wrote an article saying we didn't believe it at first, but he's onto something. That this is legit. But it's one of the great sort of shocking finds in the history of archaeological study in the Americas. But there'll certainly be more of these to come. Again, all of this started about 15,000 years ago. So we're going back. BP, by the way, means before the present. So just a simplification of the old AD, BC, or BC AD, or BCE and CE. I try to use BP most of the time, but sometimes I'm using sources that use one or the other. There's now three. So Clovis culture and Clovis points on the map. In the map on the left, you see in those little gold circles, some of which are very sort of so condensed they make a circle or a blob. All of those are separate Clovis sites where artifacts have been found. The most famous artifacts found at these hundreds and hundreds of sites are Clovis points. And you see examples of those, of course, on the bottom right. These are arrowheads, spear tips, or spear tips, I guess, that you see. And these have become famous because it's one of the main pieces of evidence used by archaeologists to conclude, and I think there's pretty much unanimity on this, that it's true, that all of those settlements, all those places in sort of gold there, came from kind of the same group of people. That they started to splinter and move and migrate, one sort of hiving off from another, and ended up spreading then kind of all over what's now the present-day United States, and even sort of above the north and below. And again, one of the main pieces of evidence, though not the only one, is that the arrowheads or spear points are remarkably similar from one place to the other. So much so that scholars have concluded that these people have to have been related. They have to have been descendants, or they're, kind of cousins that moved away, because their technology and other things are so similar. Brian Fagan, one of the great writers on this subject, says about 11,000 BC, the highly distinctive Clovis culture appeared all over eastern North America, the Great Plains, and much further afield. These Paleo-Indian people are the first well-documented inhabitants of the New World, but many questions still remain about their ancestry and life ways. What is certain, however, is that the Clovis culture was relatively short-lived. It flourished for about 300 years, and then at about 11,000 BC, evolved into a multitude of hunting and gathering cultures. So it only sort of flourished as a somewhat united culture, and I'm stretching the word united even, for a few hundred years. But the presence, is widespread, in some ways, kind of ubiquitous in North America. But keep in mind, as I said in the earlier slide, this group of people was once thought to be the first inhabitants, and that discovery in Monteverde in Chile sort of blew this out of the water. But it does seem unlikely, even though the evidence is strong, that a people would have gone through before these guys and gone all the way down to the tip of South America without really stopping. They were in a damned hurry to get through, North America to get to South America, and yet these people stayed kind of closer to, Alaska. So again, lots of question marks there that are very interesting ones. We now get to the Paleo-Indians. I told you there'd be a lot of name changes here as the ancestors to Native Americans. Paleo-Indian and Clovis peoples are sometimes used interchangeably. I don't really want to get into that's not entirely true, but let's just we're going to call them Paleo-Indians now, but we don't really need to distinguish. As our lovable textbook author says, Paleo-Indians entered a hunter's paradise teeming with wildlife that had never before confronted human predators, armed with razor-sharp spears. Ample food permitted that Paleo-Indian population, or that population, to grow. He said, basically saying that Alaska in that time period was a cornucopia of hunter-gatherer foodstuffs. So no wonder they came and stayed in the region for so long. And did only start to move out of it, some of them, when the ice age and ice sheets began to recede. But keep in mind that ample food creating a population to grow at one time doesn't necessarily mean that's going to last forever, which may explain why once they had the opportunity to move further to the south, that so many of them did. Population growth then led to splintering of groups and moving elsewhere. They may have, as we already know, contributed to or hunted megafauna into extinction. As hunter-gatherers, and we know that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was similar across the globe, but now we're zeroing in on Native Americans, or the Paleo-Indians as their ancestors, Clovis peoples, that they were nomadic. So basically this is the same as our sort of slide on the global version of hunter-gatherer life. And most of the rest of that is the same as well. Mammoths and bison, the moose was another megafaunal type of animal hunted. Value system of cooperation and sharing with competitive features. But again, that's consistent with sort of the global model for hunter-gatherers or foragers. the advance of collective learning, organization, right, and technology. So you want to take down one of these? I don't. Partly because I don't like hunting animals anyway, but I want no part of that. I don't know if that's drawn exactly to scale, but I just put it there to get the point. This is not going to be an easy thing to do, thousands of years ago. So you want to take one of these things down, then you better know what the hell you're doing. You better have technology that's complex enough to get the job done, and or a plan that's rational enough, sort of systematic enough that everything sort of goes like clockwork, or you're in trouble. This is not going to be an easy task. So human beings, in this case, the Paleo-Indians, had to use their brain power to develop the technology that's sophisticated enough for these kind of hunts, and the organizational ability that's sophisticated enough for these kind of hunts. In both cases, the technology and the organizational plan come from human brain power, the human ability to think, right? Because even the technology, in this case, violent technology, or technology that unleashes violence, still comes from the human brain. This is created by human beings. Making spears, eventually bows and arrows. Those are from the human mind. So we oftentimes, I think even now, we know it's not true, but it's easy to kind of fool ourselves into thinking it's true. That our weapons technology shows how strong we are. I mean, like physically strong. But the weapon itself is lethal, like a gun. A gun is lethal because it's a remarkable example of human ingenuity, human creativity, human ability to think, to build machines. It's the gun only unleashes violence because of the human brain. It has little to, if anything, to do with human brawn. It doesn't take muscle power other than to sort of pull the trigger. The same is true of spears, bows and arrows, etc. So organizational skills, growing technological complexity, again our word complexity here back again, was necessary for this to happen at all. There's one, I think, addendum I should add to this, one qualification, and that is that a lot of these megafauna in the Americas appear to have in a sense, almost walked into their demise. This one probably as well. And that's because this is true somewhat in Australia as well. Australia was settled a little before the Americas, but also one of the later places that human beings moved to in the world. And so in both places you see the megafauna going extinct fairly quickly after the arrival of the first peoples there. And what's similar about them? Well, it's because of, again, both of them were places where humans arrived rather late. In places like Africa and Asia, big animals, all animals, had been around humans for hundreds of thousands of years. So they'd already genetically adapted through the process of evolution. They already kind of knew about humans and what what their tricks were and what they did, and so they'd already developed defenses for it. But these people just kind of show up out of nowhere, right, to confront animals that have no, they have no defenses against them because they never dealt with them before, and so they probably underestimated them. Right, here are these little creatures on two legs, kind of spindly looking little creatures. I don't have to worry about them. Stomp, stomp, stomp. And the next thing you know, there's 10, 15, 30, 50 spears in you if you're the, I guess I underestimated them. So animals don't learn, of course, like we do with cultural passing on of knowledge from generation to the next. They don't accumulate knowledge generationally, as you see the Paleo-Indians doing here, and so puts them at a disadvantage in this kind of a situation. From Paleo-Indians to Archaic cultures, we get another name change here. New opportunities and population pressure. As Alan Taylor, gifted historian who has won a Pulitzer Prize. He's so gifted. Formerly a professor at UC Davis. He's now moved on to the East Coast, and he's a professor at the University of Virginia. But I had a chance to meet him one time years ago when he was at Davis. But writes really good books. I'll be quoting him more than once and in more than one of his books. He's so good. So he said, no Eden lasts for long. Remember Gardens of Eden. An abundant diet permitted explosive population growth, which in turn pressed against local supplies of plants and animals. As bands grew too large for a locale to sustain, they subdivided with new bands, hiving off in pursuit of more distant animal herds. By about 9,000 years ago, people could be found from Alaska to the southernmost tip of South America, a distance of some 8,000 miles. He goes on to say, American archaeologists distinguish the peoples leading this more complex and more locally framed way of life between about 9,000 and 3,000 years ago as Archaic, to distinguish them from their Paleo-Indian ancestors. In the temperate climes, people began to live for longer periods in semi-permanent villages. They also settled in larger groups within smaller territories and began to modify the environment to increase the yield of plants and animals that sustained them, which of course means that it's leading to agriculture. So the Paleo-Indians and Archaic cultures or peoples are basically the same peoples. It's just the Paleo-Indians are like their grandparents, or back further in time. And so why do we even bother changing their name? It's because this move from Alaska, you see the arrow here, the sheets of ice opened up right in that spot, and people came through that corridor. But so this is a major change, so much so, scholars are saying we need to change the name so that people remember this is a turning point. But there's another reason it's a turning point too, and that's because, as Taylor is alluding to in the quotes there, that this is the first time that peoples in the Americas start to, one, not all of them, but some of them start to practice agriculture, and two, as they spread out into, more and more ecosystems and different environmental regions of the Americas, their cultures start to become more distinct and more diverse. Not surprisingly, when they were in Alaska for those thousands of years before they could get, through the ice, the cultures were fairly homogeneous. They live in the same, type of environment, cold, right? Ice a lot of the year. So not surprising that their cultures were relatively homogeneous. And also not surprising that once they break out into the Americas with, all kinds of different climate and, environmental, differences, deserts and forests and high mountains and, coastal peoples and people living in valleys, people living on the plains, then you start to see greater cultural diversity there. So for all these reasons, they get a name change from Paleo-Indians to the Archaic peoples or cultures. So we're going to dig in now to this sort of next phase in what we could call Native American history. And this brings us sort of to, again, the takeoff of environmental to cultural diversity. So why are cultures so diverse? Not just here, but we could answer this in a general sense as well. But it's partly, at least it starts with environmental differences, as I've already kind of said in so many words, but it bears, I think, making more clear. If you live in an environment that's, say, a coastal environment, as opposed to a high mountainous forest environment, of course you're going to have different technology. So at least that part of culture is going to be different. But you're likely to have some different views and values and customs as well that are based directly or at least indirectly on sort of the different physical environment that you're inhabiting and learning how to navigate. So that's the first place to go to understand cultural diversity. From there are a lot of other factors. So neighboring peoples, who you might come in contact with through trade or war, and their ideas rub off on you, or vice versa. And so cultural diversity can come that way as well, where sort of a neighbor on one side sort of changes their way of doing something because they come in contact with another group, and the neighbor on the other side sort of doesn't. And so their culture stays the same, and over time is quite different from the one that has come in contact with other peoples. But the place to begin to see cultural diversity is to see environmental diversity, and we'll have cause to come back to this in a more specific application. Remember also, as part of the definition of archaic, we see at least some Native Americans in some places going through the Neolithic Revolution after about 4,000 years ago in certain places. First, horticulture, which is kind of like gardening, small scale harvesting or planting of crops, and then large scale farming, actually really large scale in some areas. Quoting from Charles Mann, another noted intellectual on this subject, the Neolithic Revolution is the invention of farming, an event whose significance can hardly be overstated. The human career, wrote historian Ronald Wright, he's now quoting somebody else, I'm quoting him, divides in two: everything before the Neolithic Revolution and everything after it. It began in the Middle East about 11,000 years ago. That's ancient Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, already mentioned. Native Americans who left Asia long before agriculture missed out on the bounty. Researchers have long known that a second independent Neolithic revolution occurred in Mesoamerica, which is sort of Middle America, like Mexico, Central America, now thought to have occurred about 10,000 years ago in a few places at first. So because the peoples in the Americas were the last peoples to inhabit a new continent, they kind of then were just as luck would have it, or bad luck, they were behind in sort of getting agriculture. They didn't come across any other peoples for thousands of years. Not until Europeans arrive and start imposing themselves uninvited do they start to interact with at least non-Native American cultures. So we are seeing aspects of the Neolithic Revolution in some parts of North America from this point forward. We're going to take a look at least North America region by region. I'm not going to cover, I think, all the regions on this map, but most of them. So a glance at regional cultures to see examples of change, complexity, diversity, interaction with nature, and values are 5 things to remember. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that I'm going to give you a comprehensive, detailed, full history of each one of these regional groups or areas. We don't have the time, first of all. So I'm going to go through these places region by region and give you some selected examples that show one or more of the 5 things to remember about Native Americans. So in the process, you'll get, I think, a pretty good understanding of Native American culture and ways of doing things, and differences in diversity as well. But this won't be a comprehensive history. Professor Rourke says most archaic Indians migrated from place to place to harvest plants and hunt animals. I did that twice. In regions with especially rich resources, they developed permanent settlements. Archaic peoples followed practices in distinctive ways in the different environmental regions of North America. So we're going to start in the subarctic, up in Canada, move to the Great Plains, which is kind of in the middle, and then kind of go around clockwise from there. Northeast, southeast, southwest, Plains, California, and Northwest. So I'm skipping 2 of those, but the rest of them we'll cover. So we're kind of moving in a somewhat rational, directional pattern. Before we do that, however, I want to sort of make one statement. There's no really great place to put this, but I think this is it works here. Extensive trade networks were already widespread by this period, and certainly after, more so. And extensive trade, I think, is always a good example of complexity of any group of people in any part of the world. Keep in mind, this is before modern technology, and this is there's no wheel in the Americas here, and yet they're able to move this far and wide and have this large and complex network of trade. The brown arrows sort of mark the trade routes, roughly speaking, and the little green nodules are trade centers. People of different sort of groups came together from far and wide to make deals and make trades. Different products, different commodities, different objects, obsidian, whatever it may be. How do we know that sort of long distance trade took place? There are a number of ways, but one of them is really straightforward and simple. If you find seashells from the Gulf of Mexico up in the Great Lakes region, and you do see the trade going that far, like how the hell did these things get here? Trade. So if something is found where it doesn't belong, it likely got there because of trade. And there's extensive evidence of this, and this is partly how we know about these trade networks. Something also, I think, worth pointing out here is nobody designed this trade network. This is an example of what one 20th century intellectual called spontaneous order. It's a controversial term, and I don't think it explains everything in the world. And he thought it was a gift to humanity that this kind of thing happened. I think that's questionable in some senses, in some applications, but I do think he's right in some ways. And here, whether it's a good or a bad thing, I think it does happen. So what does that mean? Spontaneous order. It means this fantastically complicated network of trade was not planned out. It wasn't like anybody's, and you already kind of know that, but I don't think we would have thought of it had I not stopped on it right up. Nobody said, okay, let's have a trade center here, and we'll have routes, build a sort of path to the next one to the south there, and we'll have another one there, and let's put some over here or whatever. Okay, does this look good to you guys? Anything? I don't know, let's tweak it. No. These things evolved through practice. I don't mean like practice like you're practicing to get better at a sport, but through everyday use. And so these things sort of gradually came into existence through activity. They weren't a rational plan. This, in a sense, this was done unintentionally. And yet it worked out to be, in a sense, a brilliant, form of, being able to get the resources that they need. Professor Mann says, again, by 1000 AD, trade relationships had covered the continent for more than 1,000 years. Mother of pearl from the Gulf of Mexico has been found in Manitoba, Canada, and Lake Superior. Copper has been found in Louisiana. I don't have copper, that type of copper in Louisiana, and yet it's been found there. Trade. This one. Now, one last thing here. As complex as this is, it's misleading in one way as well. Although this, in a sense, makes it even more complex. If you look at the little arrows and lines in brown, and going to or from a little green nodule, it can appear at first glance as if one group of people, traders, caravan of people, are going, say, from the Gulf of Mexico or Baja California or whatever, all the way to the Great Lakes, because there are arrows to the far. But what this map is telling you is that every time a group, maybe not every time, most of the time, when a group stopped at the next nodule over, they trade all their stuff away right there and then go back home. They're not going all the way from Mexico to the Great Lakes or vice versa. They're only going part of the distance because that's all they need to do. So we've got our obsidian with us. We know the next people, this next trade center over, where there's different peoples from different parts of America there. Obsidian is in high demand, and we need, textiles. We need baskets. And so we're going to go just that far and trade the baskets. And yet the obsidian gets all the way to the end of the line, but it changes hands numerous times in order to do that. So in almost no cases here does the long distance trade get taken by any one person or group of people more than part of the distance. And that wasn't planned out either. It just worked out that way, evolved into such a sophisticated, complex process.